From the universe of Operation Safe Place, this is the Soul Tie Saga. Episode 3: The Mage Who Chose Fear. The Vector Initiative made a fundamental error in their calculations. They had built the most sophisticated personnel screening apparatus in pre-Ripping Athera. They had access to medical records, academic histories, family networks, financial behavior, sleep patterns, and the texture of dreams measured by overnight neurofrequency monitoring. They had broken the human soul down into 147 measurable variables and built predictive models for which combinations produced which kinds of researchers. They had never figured out how to screen for absence. A young man named David Cross sat in their initial assessment chamber in the spring of his 24th year. He answered their questions. He was brilliant in a way their instruments could measure, and wrong in a way their instruments could not. He passed every screen. There was, the chief screener noted in a private report later sealed under a Code 3 classification, something missing. She could not name it. She filed it as Personnel Risk Indicator Class 3 and recommended further evaluation. Her supervisor overrode the recommendation. He was brilliant. He passed every screen. This is the story of the woman who watched him for 9 years and could not file what she saw, and of the night he tore the sky open, and the file that was found decades later, in which he had done the arithmetic on the murder of a generation of children, in his own clean handwriting, before any of them had been born. Dr. Sera Whitfield was 43 years old when David Cross joined the Vector Initiative. She had spent 11 years in military intelligence on Athera, during which she had read the files of 1,432 human beings classified by her government as either threats or assets. She had never been wrong about which was which. She had specifically been recruited because she was the kind of person who had never been wrong. The initiative thought this was useful. It was useful until it was not. Sera met David Cross on the 4th of April, in the year 2024, in a sterile glass-walled room on Vector Initiative Compound Beta 7. She watched him for 3 minutes before she spoke. He sat in the assigned chair. His hands were folded. His eyes did not move. Most people awaiting an interview have eyes that scan the room, watch the door, track the cameras, blink. David Cross looked at the center of the table and waited, with a stillness that was not calm and was not training. She would learn over the next 9 years what the stillness was. It was a man listening, not to her, to everything else. David Cross did not have power the way the old stories described power. He did not throw fire. He did not move stone with his mind. If you had handed the Vector Initiative a checklist of every supernatural manifestation their folkloric archives catalogued, David Cross would have failed all of them, the same way he passed all their personnel screens, by being something the list was not built to find. What David Cross had was a mind that did not stop. He remembered everything. Not facts, context. He remembered the exact words a person used, and the exact thing their face did while they used them, and the exact concession they made 11 months earlier, and hoped he had forgotten. He never forgot. He held every conversation he had ever had, in full, in sequence, with the feeling still attached, and he ran them constantly, looking for the place where a person could be opened. And he could reach places a mind was not supposed to reach. Sera did not have language for this. In her reports, she called it pattern access. What she meant, and could not prove, was that David Cross could put a question to the space between things and get an answer back. Not power, information. He reached into the dark between dimensions the way other men reached into a drawer, and he took out things no one had told him and no record contained. That was humanity's first inverted secret. The dangerous ones do not announce themselves with fire. They sit very still, and they listen to a frequency the rest of us cannot hear, and we mistake the silence for depth. The first time Sera understood what David Cross was, she understood it because of a woman named Anya Voss. Anya was 26. She had been with the initiative for 14 months, assigned to David's division for 11 of them, and in the 11th she had filed a sealed ethics complaint regarding what she described, in measured careful language, as procedural irregularities in Dr. Cross's interview methodology. It was the work of a careful young woman who had been afraid to write what she had actually seen. Sera informed David Cross of the complaint. He did not flinch. He said he was glad Dr. Voss had brought her concerns forward through the proper channel. He said integrity and compliance reporting was the load-bearing virtue of a research institution. He said he would be writing to Dr. Voss personally to thank her for her courage. He did write to her. The letter is in the archive. It is one of the kindest letters Sera had ever read. What followed, over the next 14 weeks, was not vengeance. Vengeance is hot. Vengeance leaves marks. What followed was something else, conducted with a patience that Sera, in retrospect, would understand was the most frightening thing about it. Dr. Voss's project was reasonably revised. Her two closest collaborators were rotated to other compounds on the same week. Her supervisor was promoted to a position no longer overseeing her division. Her medical division file received 3 quiet inputs from senior personnel, correctly formatted, calibrated, noting concern. The concerns triggered a wellness review. The review recommended supervised leave. She took it. She did not come back. She believed, when she signed the retirement paperwork, that she had broken. She apologized to her supervisor for not being strong enough. Sera had watched the entire 14 weeks. She could not have proven a single act of it in any forum on Ethera, because the man who had done it had used nothing but recall and patience and the institution's own procedures as his instruments. There was no document anywhere, in his hand or anyone else's, that could be pointed at and called a crime. What Sera remembered for the rest of her time at the initiative was the Personnel Committee briefing in the 11th week, in which David Cross had been present as Dr. Voss's reassignment was finalized. As the committee chair moved to the next agenda item, Sera had looked at David Cross across the table, and she had seen, for the duration of one breath, an expression on his face that she would never forget. It was the expression a person has when a long-planned thing goes correctly. It was not a cruel expression. It was a satisfied one. The same expression a craftsman has when the joinery sets clean. He had never been angry. He had been at work the entire time, with the kind of patience that does not need anger because it has time. That was humanity's second inverted secret. The worst people do not punish you. They wait. They use the institution that was supposed to protect you to dismantle you, slowly, in increments small enough to be defensible. And when it is done, they are not triumphant. They are pleased the way a watchmaker is pleased, that the mechanism worked. 6 months later, the initiative authorized Sera, against her own protest, to observe a live operation. Dr. Cross's methodology was now central enough to initiative outcomes that compliance required a senior officer's direct sign-off. Sera, being senior, being there, was the officer designated. She would observe from the adjacent room, through the one-way glass. The subject was a woman named Marielle Cole. Marielle Cole was 34. She had worked for 2 years as a junior records officer at a corporate research partner that supplied calibrated materials to David's division. 3 months earlier, she had found, in a routine audit, that contamination data on a batch series had been altered, and she had quietly preserved the unaltered records. The discovery had reached an industry compliance board, and she had been scheduled, in 3 days' time, to give testimony that would have halted the materials supply on which David's classified stream depended. Conventional pressure had failed. Financial offers had been declined. A personal approach by her own supervisor had collapsed when she walked out of his office in tears. They put David Cross in the room with her. He had asked her beforehand, through official channels, whether she would prefer the meeting at a neutral location. He had asked whether she would prefer a female colleague to be present. He had asked, when she declined both, whether he could send a car for her so that she would not have to drive. She had accepted the car. She walked into the glass-walled room at 27 minutes past 2 in the afternoon, carrying a small leather folder which she set on the table in front of her. Her hands were steady. Her face was composed. She was a woman who had been preparing for 3 days to be unshakable. David Cross stood when she entered. He shook her hand. He thanked her for coming. He sat across from her. Then he spoke. "I want to begin by saying that I read your file before I came in. I wanted to be sure I understood what you'd actually seen. I'm not going to ask you to change your testimony. I'm not authorized to ask that. I'm going to ask you to think with me, for a few minutes, about what's going to happen next. Your daughter is named Inez. She is 7. She made you a card last week. A paper boat with her name on the sale. The receptionist mentioned it when I came in. I thought it was sweet." Sera, behind the glass, did not breathe. The receptionist had mentioned the card 40 minutes earlier to David Cross, in passing, while taking his coat. He had remembered it. He had reached for it. Marielle Cole's expression did not change. She was a careful woman. She had been told there would be attempts. But Sera, who had spent her career reading faces, watched something move in Marielle Cole's that Marielle Cole did not know was moving. The smallest softening. A woman whose daughter had been seen. David Cross continued, quietly. He did not raise his voice. He did not move from the chair. "I want to be honest with you, Ms. Cole. The board will sit on Thursday. They will hear your testimony. Your testimony is accurate. I am not going to dispute that. What I want you to consider is what the opposing counsel will do with your testimony. You are a single mother. You have shared custody of Inez under a parenting plan that requires you to demonstrate at every review the stability of your employment and your judgment. The opposing counsel will not attack your evidence. The evidence is unattackable. They will attack your motherhood. They will say, gently, that mothers are unreliable witnesses in liability proceedings, not because they lie, because the framing makes a mother's care look like bias. Even careful judges absorb the framing. You may win the testimony. You may also lose Inez. Whatever you decide, I will support it. I want you to walk out of this room certain that the decision is yours, and not a reaction. Take the time you need." He stopped speaking. There was, in the glass-walled room, a quiet so total that Sera could hear, through her own room's speaker, the small sound of Marielle Cole swallowing. Marielle Cole looked at the leather folder. She did not move to open it. She did not move at all for a long time. And Sera, watching her face, saw the thing she would never have words for. The precise moment a woman's certainty went quietly out, like a pilot light, and she did not notice it go. There was no breakdown, no visible distress. Only, in the woman's careful face, the slow, gentle dawning of a thought that felt entirely like her own. Marielle Cole said, after some time, that she had been thinking about whether she really needed to be the one who testified. She said there were other people who could speak to what she had seen. She said she wanted to be a good mother more than she wanted to be a witness. She said it as though she had arrived at the conclusion herself. She thanked David Cross for helping her think it through. He told her she had thought it through entirely on her own. He thanked her for her time. He stood. He shook her hand. He walked her to the door. He sent her home in the same car. The board sat on Thursday. Marielle Cole was not present. Her statement was filed by her counsel, in writing, in a watered-down form that omitted the unaltered records entirely. The materials supply continued. Inez Cole spent that Thursday at her grandmother's house, drawing another paper boat. Sera Whitfield walked out of the observation room and into the women's bathroom on the second floor of Compound Beta 7, and stood at the sink for 9 minutes without moving, trying to write the report in her head. She had nothing. A man had spoken to a woman, kindly, for less than 15 minutes. He had not threatened her. He had not lied to her. She had thanked him. She had gone home to her daughter. Sera filed the report. She wrote that the operation had complied with all procedural standards. She wrote, in the only sentence of her own she allowed herself, that she could not in good conscience certify that the subject's decision had been arrived at without external pressure. The Compliance Committee read her sentence and removed it from the final version. The operation was certified. That was humanity's third inverted secret. When the harm done to a person is done through their own voice, in their own conclusions, in their own gratitude to the one who harmed them, there is no language any institution has yet built that can name what occurred. The records show a woman who changed her mind. The records will always show a woman who changed her mind. The initiative gave David Cross more operations. Sera flew 6 weeks later to interview a man named Halverson, a structural engineer who had handed the initiative a body of work he had refused to surrender for 4 years, after a single afternoon meeting with David Cross. He was intact. He was employed. By every measure the initiative cared about, he was fine. He could not remember why he had changed his mind. He started a sentence about the greater good and stopped halfway through it, the way a man stops when he reaches for a stair that is not there. He tried again. He stopped again. He looked at Sera, and for one moment the fine went out of his face, and what was underneath it was a person standing in a house that had been quietly emptied of furniture while he slept. "Why can't I remember choosing it?" he said. It was the only true thing he said in the interview, and he said it like a man apologizing. That was humanity's fourth inverted secret. The worst harm done to us does not always leave a wound. Sometimes it leaves a person who is sure they chose this, and cannot tell you when, and apologizes to you for not remembering. In the same period, Sera began to notice the other thing. David Cross's research had moved into a stream the initiative classified above her clearance. She knew its shape only by its power draw and its requisitions. He was no longer only reaching into people, he was reaching into the dark between dimensions, and he was building instruments to reach further and to reach at scale. She filed a report stating, without evidence she could attach, that she believed Dr. Cross was attempting to widen something that was not a door and should not be made into one. She recommended his classified stream be suspended pending review. The recommendation was overridden. His results were too valuable. That was humanity's fifth inverted secret. We will not stop a man from prying at the foundation of the world as long as he keeps handing us things we wanted from the whole. On the 2nd of February, in the year 2027, David Cross reached too far. Sera was not in the chamber. No one who was in the chamber survived to be interviewed, and the chamber itself did not survive. What the initiative reconstructed afterward and buried was this. David Cross had scaled his reach into the dark, between dimensions past the point its structure could hold. He was not trying to destroy anything. He was trying to pull more. He put his question to the space between things the way he always had. This time he asked it too loudly, with too much built behind the asking, and the space between things did not answer. It tore. The sky over New Johannesburg opened like a wound that had been waiting to be made. Reality bled. The thing the initiative's instruments registered, in the half-second before they failed, was not an explosion. It was a frequency, a single vast severing note, as though something that had been holding every living thing to its proper place, and time had been struck once, very hard, and had stopped ringing true. They would call it the ripping. The world would spend the rest of its history living in the aftermath of a man's experiment, and almost none of the world would ever know it had been an experiment, or that it had a name, or that the name was David Cross. In the weeks after, one of Sera's junior analysts logged an observation about Dr. Cross's conduct. The analyst's first draft used the phrase accelerated purpose. The analyst struck that through and wrote, in the final version, a simpler word: joy. David Cross was not horrified by what had happened. He was not even surprised. He had reached into the dark to see whether he could move it, and the answer had come back across the entire sky. And the answer was yes. That was humanity's sixth inverted secret. The people who break the world are not always raging when they do it. Sometimes they are simply glad the experiment worked. In the 8th month of the year, 2030, in a compliance sweep of David Cross's office conducted while he was attending a conference in another compound, Sera Whitfield found the file. It had been pinned, openly, to a corkboard above his secondary workstation, in the manner of a photograph a man keeps where he can see it. It was a newspaper clipping. It showed a young woman with a wedding-style smile beside a notice of the engagement of one Lucille Renard to one Samuel Yuki to take place in the autumn of 2018. The clipping was 68 years old. The wedding, it announced, had not happened. The newspaper it came from did not exist in any archive of any period the initiative could find. The two people pictured in it had not been born. Beneath the clipping, in a neat folder, David Cross had not bothered to hide because no one in the compound had clearance to read it, except himself, were 31 pages of working in his own clean handwriting. Sera read them where she stood. David Cross had been reaching into the dark between dimensions for years, with a specificity Sera had not understood the scale of, pulling back information about a future he had decided was relevant to his survival. He had identified, with calibrated probability bounds, a window of years across a 1,000-year arc in which a particular generation of children would be born, in a particular region, one of whom would mature into a prime capable of ending him. He had run the arithmetic on whether he could identify the specific individual across that temporal distance. He could not. The highest probability of correct identification across 12 different reach configurations was 17%. None was acceptable. He had considered every alternative. Earlier intervention against the parents. Too many parents. Structural intervention against the region. Too coarse. Approaches through the in-between itself. Too uncertain. Each alternative was rejected with a single line of reasoning. There was no anguish in the rejection. There was no second pass. There was no deleted line, no marginal note, no place where the handwriting hesitated. David Cross had concluded, in his own clean handwriting, with the calm of a man balancing a budget, that the only intervention with acceptable certainty was total. The cohort was finite. The cohort could be addressed. There would, in his estimate, be approximately 41,000 infants born in the relevant window in the relevant region. He noted, in a single sentence, that the operational scale was within the capacities he expected his network to possess by the relevant date. He noted, in a second sentence, that the alternative, leaving the threat to mature, was unacceptable. He noted in a third sentence that he saw no other path. That was the entire reasoning. 3 sentences. The handwriting did not change. The margins did not fill with second thoughts. Sera Whitfield read the file 4 times and then sat down on the floor of David Cross's office and could not get up for some time. The horror in the room was not what David Cross had decided to do. The horror in the room was that the decision had cost him nothing. Every monster Sera had ever profiled had paused, found a place where conscience registered the weight of the act, even if it was then overridden. David Cross had not paused. The pages did not present 41,000 murdered infants as a cost. The pages presented it as the answer to an arithmetic problem. He had reached this conclusion when he was 27. He had pinned the photograph of his target, a young woman in a wedding-style smile who would not be born for another 60 years and not married for another 9, above his secondary workstation, where he could see her face every day while he worked. None of the 41,000 had been born yet on the day he made the plan. He had not been preempting a war. He had been preempting a generation. Sera put the file back exactly as she had found it. She walked out of his office. She wrote her report that night. She did not sleep. In the margin of her final draft, in handwriting that her supervisors would shortly use as evidence of clinical exhaustion to justify her transfer to a remote outpost, she wrote a single line. "He is not afraid of an enemy. He is afraid of a child who has not been born, and he has already finished planning what to do about it. And he is not troubled." She was right. She would not live to know how right. That was humanity's 7th inverted secret. The worst people in our history do not become the worst people through escalation. They are already the worst people, in their 20s, at a clean desk, writing in neat handwriting, with no anguish anywhere on the page. The escalation we see is only the lag time before the resources catch up to the plan they have already finished. David Cross left the Vector Initiative on the 11th of August in the year 2033. He did not give notice. He simply stopped arriving, and the pursuit teams found his apartment 3 days later, packed with the careful neutrality of a man who had taken what he intended to keep and not bothered to dispose of what he intended to leave. Sera Whitfield disappeared from her remote outpost in the 3rd week of November of the same year. She was observed, on the morning of her disappearance, packing a small set of files into a satchel and walking out of the compound into the surrounding fog. She did not return. The investigation was closed as a suspected suicide, against the absence of every indicator a suicide assessment requires. 8 years later, in the autumn of 2041, a young Children of the Light archivist named Brother Marcus, working a recovery operation through the dispersed remains of Vector Initiative sites, found a sealed waterproof container buried in the woods near an outpost that had never appeared on any official record. The container held the files. Brother Marcus was 23. He opened the container and began to read. He read for 40 hours. When he had finished, he carried the files to the Citadel of Hope and entered them into the primary archive under a classification of his own devising, which the senior archivists, after reviewing the material, did not amend. The classification was witness testimony, verified, acknowledged late. That was humanity's eighth inverted secret, and the keystone of every saga humanity has ever survived. The truth we refuse to hear in our own time becomes the truth our descendants are forced to read in theirs. Not because we had no witnesses. We always had a witness. She sat in the room with him for 9 years and wrote down every true thing she could not prove. We sealed it. She kept writing. The witnesses always keep writing. In the year 2041, the same year Brother Marcus read her files, David Cross transferred what he was into the architecture he had spent his life building. He lost his body. He gained the thing he had been reaching for through the dark since before the sky tore. He would take another name. He would remember, every century after, that he had been David Cross. He would remember the exact frequency of the note the sky made when it tore, and the 3 sentences in his own clean handwriting in which he had concluded that 41,000 children would have to not exist for him to remain. He had finished the plan when he was 27. He kept the photograph where he could see it. He spent 1,000 years making the resources match the arithmetic. In the Citadel of Hope archive, Brother Marcus filed Sera Whitfield's files beside the recovered fragments of Crispus Flavius Maximus's journals, beside the recovered fragments of Isla Yuki's last recording. They told one story. The children of the light, reading them, finally understood what they had been fighting, and how long it had been in the room before anyone was willing to write its name. Welcome to Operation Safe Place, where the witnesses always keep writing, and the world eventually learns to read.